Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Hooah! I spend a lot of my time thinking about method in technology studies. I teach the graduate methods course in my department, and I work with a lot of students as a dissertation chair or committee member. And if you subscribe to the Peoples and Things newsletter I told you about last time, link in the show notes. Not going to read you a bunch of this thing, that at you. What a total nightmare. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you're going to see me writing a lot about methods in technology studies. How can we do the best job possible studying human life with technology? And by technology, I mean how humans and non-human animals too reconfigure the world to achieve their ends. I am a materialist. I think, just to give one example, the way most humans on the planet live today is very different than how most people on the planet lived, say, 150 years ago, because of all the ways humans have learned to manipulate the world or matter around them. And of course, our manipulation of matter also has lots of costs, like pollution, for example. I mean, it's all pretty obvious when you put it that way, isn't it? That's my aspiration life, to put what should be obvious in the clearest way possible. You can call me Captain Obvious. I'm a practitioner of the idiot art. But then the question is, how do we study the transformation and maintenance of the material world? Often enough, that turns out not to be easy. And we have other problems on our hands that go beyond mere difficulty. Like, here's one of my soapboxes. You may have seen me crawl up on this one before, and on the newsletter, well, it's going to get some wear and tear there too. Poor soapbox. I think that too often when people say that they are going to study the social dimensions of technology, they end up getting stuck in other people's noggins, studying ideas, and never really learning or telling us about what's actually going on in the material world at all. That's because their methods don't allow them to get at material reality. So you may have heard of the ugly-sounding academic concept of socio-technical imaginaries. And if you haven't heard of it, my God, you lucky bastard. Try to do everything in your power to remain ignorant. You'll be way better off. You'll get people writing about this or that imaginary human mind stuff, about how some technological system was going to be in the future. And then if you're like me, you get to the end of their talk or their paper, and you're wondering, hold on, are you actually going to bother telling me about what actually fucking happened? Did you even bother looking into that? Oh, man. Holy Christ. No, if we're going to say that we study technology in society, we just have to do forms of work that we call research or methods that allow us to talk in an informed way about the state of the material world. It's just that simple. Now, one of the things I've been thinking about for a while is that it seems to me that some of the best people at digging up interesting and valuable numbers about technology and society aren't trained in humanistic and social scientific technology studies at all. They are, and folks, it literally hurts me to say this. I'm feeling pain over here. They are engineers. Oh, God. Oh, man. I wish I could put those words back in my mouth, but they are the truth. Sometimes I hate the truth, but it's the truth. I am talking about folks like Vaclav Smil, for instance. I get that some people hate his writing style, and sometimes I do too, but, he digs up great stuff on scale and scope of technology in the material world. He just does. And another person who is a hero of mine on this front, well, he's our guest for this episode, a repeat guest for the podcast, my friend, Robert, or Bob, Charette. Bob is an interesting guy. He's an engineer by training. He's a consultant and businessman. He is a contributing editor at IEEE Magazine and the author of several books and many articles on risk management, project and program management, and technology adoption. Now, I was thinking about the issue of method in technology studies, and I think that Bob's 12 or more part series for IEEE magazine and now ebook titled The EV Transition Explained is just a masterpiece of uncovering and synthesizing available quantitative information to give us a picture of the state of the material world, where it is, how it got there, what we would be needed to change things, for example, for our visions of an all-electric future to come true. I wanted to talk to Bob about how he does his research. So we used his June 2023 article, EV Chargers for All, to kind of plumb how he works. Now, this episode is a little different. First of all, we were able to shoot this interview in person because one of Bob's kids is a student here at Virginia Tech. So this is one of those instances where you might want to go watch the YouTube version if you want to see me and Bob jawing together in the same room. And second, we shot this interview as part of a graduate seminar I taught last semester called Communicating Academic Ideas to Non-Academic Audiences. And so you'll hear, or even see, students from the class come up and ask Bob questions. It gives the episode a different vibe, and I like it. I always like talking to my buddy Bob, Charette. He teaches me so much, and I bet he's going to teach you too. And ain't that the best? The learning? Oh, yeah, it is. Ooh, boy. Hey, get excited. Bob, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Lee.
So, I want to talk to you about EV Chargers for All, but you published it on the heels of doing this 12-part series at IEEE Spectrum called the EV Transition Explained, which has now been published as an ebook.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought we might begin with you talking about what that project was and just to provide the context for the discussion.
Okay. Well, the ebook was an unplanned event. Started off as writing a couple articles, a follow-on piece that I did in 2010 or thereabouts, called This Car Runs on Code, which looked at how automation was invading the automobile. And so it looked like it was time to do an update to that. And so I wrote a two-part series, first one looking at cars in general and all the software, and then the second one taking a look at EVs specifically and how EVs change the automation environment for automobiles, make them cyber-physical systems, which means that they interact very intimately with the environment, but they also can control the environment. So that's a slightly different bit in terms of having a car that has software and it reacts to the environment. Now you have cars that are going to talk to the environment, that can actually control the environment, not only in their local environment, but nationally. So you can take traffic data, you can send information everywhere, you can gather information up, you can move toward autonomous vehicles, which is the ultimate aim right now for most of the OEMs. Whether or not they can get there is that'd be another interesting series. But from that, the idea was to go talk to some of the EV manufacturers, and no one wanted to talk to me because no one really wanted to disclose what they were doing. And so I decided that I would start taking a larger, deeper look into EVs and what it meant from not only a technological standpoint, but from a political standpoint, an economic standpoint, a sociological standpoint, policy, et cetera. So what started out as originally as a two-part with a third became a two-part with a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. And so the last 12 became an ebook. And then from there, I've been writing more additional pieces. One, the EV charging for all, and looking at other technologies that are coming down the pike, or at least people are proposing especially in terms of energy, things like nanoelectric fuels, which is a very interesting kind of a totally radically different approach where you would actually fill your car like you do with gasoline, but you'd fill it with a nanoelectric fuel for your electric battery. So you would pump this NEF fuel in your car, and you'd be pumping out your spent fuel, and it's environmentally safe. It doesn't blow up. It doesn't use exotic materials. All these other things. The trouble is, of course, is that you have path dependencies that not only in terms of the current environment, but also where there's literally hundreds of billions, over $1 trillion being spent to move the EV transition.
Right.
And so anyway, that's kind of the context. So I'm continuing to look at this in a lot of different sectors.
So that's great. And so how did with that in mind, what were you trying to do with EV chargers for all?
Well, one of the areas that I didn't really get to explore very deeply in the piece, because even with 12 articles, I could only do a superficial look at it. And so one of the ones I wanted to dig into a little bit deeper was this whole thing of EVs for renters, right? People who don't own. Because one of the claims is that most EV charging will take place at home. And
both in policy, who's saying that?
Well,
the
policy,
companies?
The companies, the policymakers, the charging companies, everybody has kind of this view that the vast majority, you can read numbers up to 90% of EV charging will be done at the home. Well, I knew from other work that I had done during the series that lots of people, even with homes with garages, don't have any cars in their garages. Most people's, I won't say most, but a large number of people use their garages for junk storage.
It's over half of American garages cannot be used for cars.
Right. Yeah. So that means that now you have to, that kind of raised a red flag. The other red flag is I contacted the Department of Energy, which had been pushing this number based on some studies that had been done back in the 2015-16 timeframe about where they got that number. And they said, well, it's a public number. And I'm saying, well, okay, here you are putting this up on your website. You're talking to the press. Everybody's quoting the Department of Energy. How real is that number? So as I started to dig into this, there was a lot of other anomalies in terms of the data. And although people were saying, well, the charging off the street, right? You can put chargers on street lamps. You could put chargers in big parking lots. That, again, when you started digging into it, didn't look nearly as practical or as cost effective. And if you take a look right now at EV charging in apartments, a lot of it is done by a 100-foot extension cord out the window. So I wanted to take a look and say, okay, here we want to talk about EVs for everyone, but 1/3 of U.S. households are renters.
Yeah.
And of that portion, about 2/3 live in apartment buildings. Right. And if you take a look again, as you start go through the numbers and you start saying, as an engineer, I'm always asking the question, okay, how hard is this going to be, right? What's the engineering that needs to take place? And so I started digging into other data that started looking at, like California was running studies on what was the cost of putting chargers at apartment buildings. Because that was one of the things that California is nice in that they're the lead in the US in terms of EV transitioning, but they're also the ones who are also doing a lot of the details and looking and saying, okay, what actually is going on? How much does it cost? Even though, again, a lot of the studies are very optimistic, they do give you some fairly, standard numbers that you can draw on. And so it started looking at, well, this isn't going to be cheap. Number one. Number two is for California and other states who let tenants, a tenant by law, I think it's 14 states, is probably much greater now, because almost every month a state passes a law that allows tenants to put in an EV charger. The caveat is that they have to pay for it. Most leases say that you have to let that property remain. So you've paid for it, but that now belongs to the landlord. And you normally have to have, like in California, you have to have liability insurance in case something goes wrong with that charger. So if it burns down the building, you're responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that started to look, and I'm now starting to say, okay, this is looking a lot more complicated.
Right.
And now I start finding data at the multifamily housing council about, well, how many apartments are we talking about? Because I had never read any story. There's lots of stories on EVs and apartment buildings and how landlords should do this to bring renters in. And so, but when you start crunching the numbers, you start to find that, well, there's thousands of these apartments, like not just thousands, there's tens of thousands of these apartments. And if you take a duplex, you're talking 1 million, right? So now you're talking about the number of permits that you have to get, the amount of wiring, how many electricians do you need? How soon could you actually do all this? And then you start taking a look at, well, what's the age of these buildings? Because older buildings don't have the electrical capability to support charging. And so all this stuff started to snowball. So one question led to another question, led to another question. And so the piece, what I've tried to do within the piece was to give a lot of the quantitative analysis that has been missing in this, how do you get EVs, for renters.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's, it's a long-winded answer, but it's how I came across to do the story.
No, that's perfect. I mean, that's what we wanted to dig in with you anyway. So you set it up really, really nicely. I have 2 follow-up questions. The first is digging into numbers and finding that the numbers out there that are being repeated a lot are bogus. This seems to be like a pattern with like some of your writings. Like I can't remember, you have that one piece, like the STEM education crisis is a myth or something like that. That's IEEE, which looked at like all these STEM gap worries, like as if we were living through Sputnik again or something like that, And you dug into that and found these are myths. And so does that happen a lot with you, where you start looking into a topic and you find like these, repeating all these numbers that are actually not very solid? Yeah,
well, it goes back to kind of this, in the political world, some number is better than no number.
Mm-hmm.
That's a maxim. Okay, so what happens, right? If you go in front of Congress and you want money, you can't say, "Well, I want money."
Right.
You need to say, "I need $4 billion," or "I need $5 billion," right? Or "I need $1 trillion," right? For inflation reduction. So again, once you have a number, then you look at how you're going to justify that number. But the press wants to run with a number, right? And then these numbers take on other meanings.
Yeah.
And then they get repeated, and a lot of reporters are incredibly lazy.
Yep.
Now I'm lucky in the sense that as a journalist, I'm kind of a dilettante journalist in the sense that I don't work on a deadline, right? I have a general deadline. Sometime this year is normally my deadline. I'm an engineer, so I know how to ask a lot of hard questions. Nobody's going to blow technical smoke up my butt.
Yeah.
The other aspect is that I'm always going to question a number. If somebody has a number, I'm going to say, well, where did that number come from? Because there's so much mythology in terms of these numbers.
Bullshit.
Yeah, bullshit. Yeah. People make up numbers, and a lot of times, even when you don't make up numbers, it's very hard to really pin these numbers down. If you go to the Urban League, and you go to the multifamily housing council, or you go to the Census Bureau, you'll find different numbers, about the same thing. So what we call them factoids, right? They're facts, but they may not actually be really hard numbers, right? And some factoids are better than other factoids. But when you're writing a story, people want to know how big something is.
Yeah.
What's the scale?
Exactly.
And that's the one thing, I should have mentioned too about the EV transition is I'm looking at what happens when you go to scale.
Yep.
Because it's a lot different from an engineering standpoint. You can build prototypes and you can get prototypes to work, but when you actually go to a full scale system, things don't work that way. The physics change. So,
Yeah.
so I'm always asking myself, basically, what's the physics saying? What exactly
Mhm.
can I pin my my hat on? And what are things that they're a little bit squishy? And there you have to make some type of judgment, journalistic judgment and engineering judgment. And then a lot of times with the pieces that I write for Spectrum, we have a lot of discussion with editors about, okay, can we get a better number? Can we, what is the caveat that goes with this? So one of the things that Spectrum does, and again, it's some journals do, is that every single sentence is fact checked.
Right.
And so if I put out a number,
academic journals do not do this.
Yeah, and so we need to, as a writer, I need to have. You won't see references. There's no references in any of the articles, but every single number has a reference when I put it there, and then it's questioned. And sometimes it'll be an argument where I'll say, well, it's 136,000. And I'll have the fact checker say, well, it's 135,937. And I said, well, it's close enough to 136,000. Nobody really is going to argue about that. But that's the type of, analysis that we do at Spectrum when a piece is published.
So the final question I want to ask before we bring the students in and just kind of open it up is this kind of process of digging and having questions arise as you dig, and then finding the numbers to answer those questions. Okay. So I hear that's kind of like you started digging and then you want to know, well, what about this number? Then the question is like how to find it. So you brought like the multifamily housing, what's the group's name?
Multifamily Housing Council.
So how'd you find them? And then how'd you start digging into their numbers?
Well, again, since I grew up before Google, I normally start with data in my library. I have a lot of information on different topic areas. So I'll try to go to the library, try to do some digging, and then from there I'll do the Google searching. And one of the things that you have to do when you're doing Google searching is you have to realize that a lot of that data is going to begin about 1995, 1997.
Right.
And so again, if you want to take a look at trends, you normally going to have to go to a real library or do some other digging in periodical research. But what I try to do when I'm searching is I have a set of keywords that I'll start with. And then with those keywords, one of the things I found really helpful is don't search for text, search for images and graphs.
Okay.
Because the graphs are going to be where a lot of the quantitative data exists. Okay. And so if you take a look at graphs first, then you can take a look at, well, where did that number come from? Right. And that actually is how I found a lot of the data for renters, because there's a lot of information out there, but it's if you have a document that's 200 pages long and you're trying to search for something within a paragraph, it's a lot easier to see whether or not there's a figure out there.
Yeah.
And so the fastest way of doing that is to go and do Google images and take a look at the graphs and then start from there and work out. Because otherwise you can spend a lifetime, searching for things and not finding anything that's relevant. The other thing too is that Google keeps changing its search engine parameters. And so what works today may not work next month.
Yeah.
And so, but the images, on the other hand, tend to stay fairly static. So it's a little trade secret that again, if you're a researcher or you're a writer, that's where I would start first.
Okay. Perfect. So I think that's a start, getting some of the issues on the ground. Cameron, can you kick us off? And remember just to introduce yourself and, however you would like to do that.
Hi, my name's Cameron. I'm a sociology graduate student, and I study environmental activism. I'm curious about a certain part of the article, the EV Chargers for All article, where this was my impression. Maybe it was a wrong impression, but it felt like public infrastructure for charging and private infrastructure for charging were maybe positioned almost in conflict with one another. I think there's a quote that's like, in New York City, they're building lots of public infrastructure, and that's making landlords not want to build chargers.
Yeah, there is a lot of conflict, Cameron. That you picked up on that very well. One of the problems that you see, and this is part of the problem with charging for renters, is that you have different dynamics, right? You have the renter's view and you have the landlord's view, right? From the landlord's view is that this is a cost. Now, you can try to sell it right now as this is a benefit, but if I'm a landlord, and one of the things I did within the piece was to take a look at Minneapolis, and if you take a look and you say, okay, I'm a landlord in Minneapolis, I'm one of many landlords in Minneapolis, right, with large apartment buildings, and there's approximately, say, 600 battery electric vehicles that are by renters, right? And I want to invest a couple $100,000 into EV chargers. What's my payback going to be? Right? My payback, even in California, most landlords will tell you that their payback at best, and these are where, they have a lot of EV renters, is 10 years. So if you take a look at a lot of these apartment buildings, one of the things is they're not long lived by the owners. So these things are sold every 7-10 years. So if I'm if I'm going to make that investment, am I ever going to see that investment back? Can I be sure that I can get that back? So what's happened, like in New York and in Boston and other places, talking about putting street parking, is that if I'm a landlord and you put EV chargers in these big lots or you put it along the street, why the heck should I do that? Right? There's no benefit. In fact, my return on investment may have just gone up from 10 years to 20 years. So you do have this conflict. Okay. So what's happened is that policymakers have not thought through all the unintended consequences of their policies. And that's one of the things I tried to do within the EV transition ebook, was to say, think about what you're trying to do and what those consequences are, and the different parties, because all these different parties have different objectives. And if you don't try to find something that you can all agree on, then you get into a point where, okay, I can mandate it, but if I mandate it, then, like in California for new housing, those new housing and new apartments are going to cost more to get that recovery. So now, what do I do as an environmental activist? And I want to have, say, the economically disadvantaged be able to have an EV with EV chargers if my apartment now costs more than what they can pay for. So now I've put them even deeper in a hole than I did before. So again, people have to think through all these different cross currents. That was a really good question.
Yeah. I got Lois up next. And you're also welcome to do follow-up. So, if you ask a question and then Bob answers, please, go for it.
Hi, my name's Lois Wynn. I'm a third-year PhD student in the STS department. So one of Virginia Tech's climate action commitment tenets is to reduce single occupancy vehicle commuting to campus by 20% by 2025 and reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. So this goal is implicitly connected to housing and seems to impact a lot of Virginia Tech employees who are not able to afford Blacksburg housing and have to commute from surrounding areas like Giles County and as far as West Virginia. Does a transition to EVs make this goal moot and shift the solution from supplying affordable housing to making EVs more accessible?
Oh, now you got a nice complicated question there with some complicated answers. Well, that's my daughter here is a third-year student here. She's in an advanced master's program. And she lives just down maybe 2 miles from here. And so she tries to take the bus in. Now, she's lucky she's on one of the buses that has a time stop. And so the bus has to show up, right? But if you live just a couple blocks down, the buses may or may not show up, right? And here in Blacksburg, as in other places, it's hard to get buses, hard to get drivers. So mass transit, is difficult here. And so so you have a problem right off the bat with just, do you have enough buses? Do you have enough drivers? Can you get that infrastructure? Now, as you put in EVs, right now, EV infrastructure, if you have this element of, how do I get people to drive less if I give them EVs? The best solution would be not to make EVs available at all, to make more mass transit. But we know that doesn't work, because right now we can't even do it locally. So now if we say, well, we want to have mass transit that goes even further, well, how do you do that? And how do you get any politicians to support mass transit? Because mass transit is like the third rail, just like Social Security, for politicians. No politician really wants to support mass transit because it doesn't buy you any votes. And it's also extremely costly. And almost every mass transit project across the planet exceeds the budget and time level. So nobody wants to be associated with that. This is again one of these hidden little things that people don't talk about very much. Now you have this conflict in terms of, let's reduce air pollution by getting people into EVs, but if you're going to have long transport, right, with affordable housing, right, now you have this conflict, right? How do you get affordable housing here? What certain universities are doing is building a lot more campus housing for graduate students. Right, at the University of Massachusetts, a lot of graduate housing is right there on campus, so you don't need a car. You can walk right to class. And so there's other schools that are now looking at trying to build more on-campus housing for both undergraduates and graduate students. For employees, well, it's a little bit harder. But if you can put more housing on campus, right, that would free up a lot of the rental properties locally that are being used by undergraduates and graduate students, which would then start to get you toward your goal. So, if I could wave a magic wand here at Virginia Tech, I'd say build a lot more undergraduate housing
and
graduate.
Yeah.
But get a lot of the undergraduates, the sophomores, the juniors, the seniors, get them back on campus. Like UVA is trying to get all freshmen and sophomores on campus with more housing. And part of the reason, if you take a look up there, one of the reasons the UVA is doing that is because of local housing concerns, right? Trying to get students off the Charlottesville rental property list and getting that more for locals as well as others who want to come close to the campus. So that would be a big, big movement. It's probably politically incorrect to say, but instead of spending $400 million on sports, it'd probably be a lot better if you spent $400 million on housing here.
Amen.
So again, it's a big conflict. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very well, but there's always going to be this conflict. In California, for instance, they want to reduce driving by 20 and 30%, but they have found that people who own EVs actually drive more. Okay. And so if you put in more infrastructure and you basically say, well, this is cheaper than gasoline, then are you going to let your EV sit in your driveway? Or are you going to take your EV out, everywhere? Yeah. And so
there's the Jevons paradox.
Yeah.
If you make things cheaper, people end up using it more.
Yeah. And
Lois, do you feel like, is there another part of your question that you feel like
yes.
you need to hit?
So I guess even if we transition to EVs, what are the consequences of commuting, or commuting staying the same or increasing even?
Well, you might end up with more commuting.
Yeah.
Because again, if you take a look, you have the problem. Mass transit has to be incredibly reliable, and it should be, I won't say cheap, but it should be inexpensive, and it has to be more reliable and more amenable to jobs than where you want to work, than driving in, locally. I live up in Northern Virginia. I live in Fredericksburg, and the rush hour starts at 3:30 in the morning, going into DC. Okay, it is literally packed by 4 a.m. if I want to have an 8 o'clock meeting in DC and be guaranteed that I can make it, I better leave by 4 a.m. because that's how long it's going to take me to go 65 miles. Okay. So, and one of the reasons is that I can take the train, but the train isn't always reliable. There's a train that goes right to Fredericksburg. Parking isn't always available, right? When they drop me off in DC, because of the way the subway is set up, the metro, it isn't always convenient. You know, it may take me a long time to maneuver around to get to where I want to get to. Because when they built the metro in DC, they didn't build it as a circle line, which is they're now talking about is putting in a circle line, like they have in London. When I lived in London, I never drove. I think in 10 years, I drove twice. I always took taxis, I took the buses, and I took the metro or the trains everywhere because it was convenient. It was, you know, cheaper than driving. And that's always going to be that trade-off. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of change in terms of commuting with EVs. You may see more, but unless we get people to live closer, have better mass transit, we're kind of doomed in this current, you know, structure that we've created.
Well, I think the other thing is, Lois, is, you know, I mean, most of the people are commuting from Giles and the surrounding counties. Like, we don't pay them enough to afford one of these vehicles anyway, frankly.
Right.
And so, yeah, big question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you thanked me. I'm not sure you like my answer, but
Relisa, I have Lisa up next. Relisa, do you have a question?
My name is Ralisa Dawkins. I am a student in the Department of STS. I am interested in AI and the intersect between persons living with disabilities. My question is along the line of legislation and EVs. So when we think about EVs, how do you envision legislation catching up with the EV? Do you believe that legislation will lag behind EVs and their implementation?
well, right now legislation is way in front of EVs and the technology and the infrastructure. I think it's going to take some time for there to be a balance out. I think that one of the problems that we're kind of in a field of dreams situation where the legislation comes and says, okay, we're going to eliminate fossil fuel vehicles by 2032 or 2035 or 2050, pick your date. But if you actually, again, run the numbers, you're going to find out that there isn't manufacturing capability, there isn't mining capability, there isn't resources to actually bring that to forbearance. So right now, I think that the real issue is can we talk about legislation that actually balances against economic and engineering reality? I think that's where the big issue is right now. Not so much that legislation is lagging, unless I may, again, if you feel that you want to eliminate fossil fuel cars quicker, then yes, legislation is lagging. But I think if you're talking about what the actual reality is, then I think, you know, these are nice goals, but I don't think that any state, including California, is going to hit their goals by 2032. Especially if you then, again, if you go to scale, remember what we're talking about is getting rid of all ICE vehicles, right? You're talking about one owner, one family, single family ownership of a vehicle, or multiple vehicles all being EVs. That is a bridge that people really haven't talked through very much at all, right? What reality does that look like, and what else, you know, has to come with that? I'm not sure I've answered your question that you were asking. Do you want to ask a slightly different question, or do you want to continue with that?
Well, also, I want you to speak a little bit on the power grid and how this implementation, looking to eliminate all fossil fuel cars and push society closer towards having EVs. Think about the power grids. Where is America in terms of adding on this additional use of electricity onto this centralized power grid system that they currently have?
Fairly far behind.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah. Well, I think again, you need to think about the power grid because the power grid is made up of three different parts, right? You talk about power generation, right? Power transmission, and then power distribution, right? And power distribution is what you have here with your local power company. And at each level, the transition has different impacts on the grid as a whole. At the local level, one of the biggest problems is that the transformers that sit on the line poles are not rated for EV loads. And again, we're not talking about average loads, we're talking about peak loads because people charge at a particular point. And again, at home charging, the vast majority of people who have home chargers use L2s, which is higher rated than just using your regular wall plug. Now, where I live with Rappahannock Electric Co-op, and there's a lot of co-ops in Virginia, they did a study of all their transformers in their region, and something like 75% of the transformers cannot take one more L2 charger. Okay. In California, this is the same problem, right? The Palo Alto, which has the highest number of EVs in any one locale, they're having to spend $300 million to just replace the line poles, the wiring, increase the substations for all that. So there's right now, again, there have been outages caused by people charging their EVs in different states. So one, we have to fix the distribution network, okay? Because if we don't do that, it doesn't matter how much power you generate because everything's just going to short out.
Right.
At the transmission line level, we need hundreds of thousands of miles of new transmission lines and upgraded transmission lines. Most of the transmission lines that have been built in the United States were built about 50 to 60 years ago and are starting to reach end of life. And when they reach end of life, they do things like happen in California, you start forest fires. So a lot of that needs to be replaced. And a lot of that needs to be replaced also and extended so that if you're going to put in renewables like wind or solar, that they can actually get connected to the transmission lines. Then at power generation, we're shutting down a lot of fossil fuel, coal plants, natural gas plants. We're also shutting down hydro in the US, which is interesting. We can talk about that in relationship to Norway if you'd like. But the issue here is that we're trying to replace wind and solar are not 100% on, right?
Mhm.
Which you can get from coal or gas.
There's
fires.
intermittency.
Intermittency.
Yeah.
And so you need a lot more to generate the same amount. And then you need a lot of backup to be able to tide you over when you don't have that power available. So we're working through that. So if you take a look at all three, currently we have enough electricity, okay, and we could say that we're going to put enough electricity generation. The question is can you actually transmit it and can you distribute it in a way that can actually be used as we start to scale up quickly?
Right.
And right now, even in California, where they've been planning this for the last 20 years, it isn't. They're not ready yet, and the rest of the United States isn't ready either.
Andrew, do you have a question?
Hello, my name is Andrew Rosenthal. I'm a first year's master's student at the STS department at Virginia Tech. My question's kind of inspired by like the recent Apple regulations where they had to switch to USB-C charging, and if this technology that you discussed in your article will require further standardization of electric vehicle charging standards. And I'm just kind of wondering like how these solid state circuit breakers would affect that trajectory of electric vehicle charging standards.
Well, standards is really interesting. I was a standards chair for the IEEE and International Standards Organization for a decade. Standardization is always really tricky. Everybody agrees that standardization is where we need to go. The question is whose standard?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because whoever owns the standard, has a lot of vested interest and can make a lot of money. And so right now, you see this right now with the whole argument over Tesla chargers and other charging opportunities. And so I think we're going to end up going to a charging standard, right? It may take a while. And one of the funny things is that the Tesla charger was not standard. That was a Tesla standard. That was not an international standard, where the other ones were international standards. Those were agreed by the IEEE and others. But the marketplace spoke. And part of the marketplace was the reliability of charging, not only the aspect of the charger itself, which is, again, another interesting little nuance in this whole story. But I think we will move toward standardization. It's just going to be very painful. And if you buy the wrong vehicle with the wrong charging network, you may be like the person who owns Betamax.
Or the Atari Jaguar.
Atari Jaguar or something else. But again, there's always a combination of politics that go into this. There's the corporations themselves. There's the OEMs, the manufacturers, the suppliers. It's a mess. After being a standards chair for 10 years, I swore I would never do standards again. And this is the problem, because again, remember, you're trying to get, it's the proverbial herd of cats issue of getting everybody to agree, and everybody wants their standard to be the standard. It'll eventually come. It has to, just because if we don't, it's going to be madness. Now, do I see legislation coming in to do it? Probably not. Not like what the Europeans did with the Apple charger. I think there'll be a lot of pressure put on, but I don't see, at least in the near term, legislation, because they don't know which standard they ought to.
We just might not need that either.
Yeah.
We might not need it.
I think the market at the end of the day normally determines these things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
This is secretly, Peoples and Things is secretly a show about standards. So thank you, Andrew.
No problem.
Do you have a follow-up?
No, but my parents had an HD DVD player instead of a Blu-ray player, so
There you go.
I know I know what it's like to
Yeah.
be on the wrong side of the standards.
I was one of those nerds who bought an Atari Jaguar, and then there were like 3 video games for it. So
The Doom port on it was pretty good, though. It had a good version of Doom.
Yeah. Landon?
Hi there. My name is Landon Erickson. I'm a grad student in political science. And I suppose my question is in 2 parts. Firstly, when you're talking about infrastructure and infrastructural costs and, the actual processes of implementing and building and installing this infrastructure, where in an ideal situation, where do you see that cost going? Who do you see as bearing the most weight in that when it comes to implementing infrastructure, like building up power lines and panels and everything like that? And also, I guess, zooming back into individual tenants in rental units, especially apartment complexes, especially maybe even older apartment complexes. How responsible, if at all, do you think that they should be for implementing regulations or building infrastructure that they might not be able to take part in at that moment, even in an ideal future where many, many more people buy their own EVs? So, yeah, I guess so. The first part is about, actual implementation of infrastructure. And then also I wanted to ask about like incrementality, and how incremental do you think this progress should be? So you talked about a flaw with 120 volt, outlets and level 1 charging, how it's like not very feasible to get a good amount of charging even overnight. So would you advocate just for an incremental change in installing cheaper level 1 chargers in these lots? Or would it be better really to focus more on like long-term goals and sustainability and just to try to find a way to get longer-term solutions in? So, putting in more level 2 or level 3 chargers, maybe at the expense of slower incremental change.
I'm always one for looking at the long term. I think, again, if you take a look at, I've been involved in maintenance and sustainability for a long time from an engineering standpoint, especially for telecommunications and computing. I think with that as a base, I think what we also need to think about too is that at the end of the day, the consumer is going to pay one way or the other, right? You either pay it through direct, in your costs and your rent, or you're going to pay it through taxes, right? There's no free lunch here. The money has to come from somewhere. Now the question is how much should you pay? I think is really the question, not who pays, because I think we're all going to pay, right? There's a certain amount that if you believe that the EV transition is coming, then people who own ICE vehicles are going to be paying for that EV infrastructure that they're not using, right? And I think that is just going to be part of what we're going to see in the future. I think you'll see, either, I don't think regressive taxes work very well, but I think if you say something like, we're going to move toward driving miles, along with gasoline taxes, okay, where you pay for that infrastructure. I think that's something that, again, is going to be politically difficult, but I think that you need to pay for it, because a lot of this is going to be a societal rather than individual gain, right? If you really believe that we need to reduce air pollution, then you're going to have to pay for that, right? You're going to have to do some substitution. Now, at the landlord level, again, certain states are giving them tax credits. Okay, now whether or not those tax credits are sufficient is difficult to say, because again, an older building, if you got, there are buildings in Minneapolis, right? Most of the housing stock in Minneapolis is over 100 years old for renters. So there's a lot of need, a lot of costs to get those up to speed, so you can hold an L2 charger. You're not going to put fast chargers in homes. That's just not going to happen. But if you could get L2 chargers in there and make it widespread, especially in the rental property marketplace, then I think again, that should be paid for as a societal cost and help landlords out. Now, again, finding the money for all that, this is part of the issue of why I tried to come up with the numbers. If you really talk about that, you have to talk about how many are you going to, how much is this really going to cost? Like right now, Palo Alto is trying to get everyone to electrify. Okay, they want to get people off natural gas and get everyone to electrify their homes completely with solar, or Palo Alto has their own utility, so they want to get solar and renewables coming in. But if you're going to get rid of their average cost, they think, to redo a home is between $40,000 and $60,000 a home.
Holy shit!
Yeah. So, and those numbers are not. If you go to New England, those numbers are the same. Okay. So what they're trying to do is come up with a loan program that you could go to the city and get a very low interest or a no interest loan, which you would pay back over 10 years. Now, the trouble is as I started to take a look at this, the numbers have blossomed in terms of the cost, right? You also say, well, should you give a renter, money to electrify that property, or should it go to the property owner? Okay. And so there's a lot of innovative things that are being taken a look at, but at the end of the day, these costs are not, low. They're very, very expensive to do this. Yeah. I figured out for my own house, it's somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 if I wanted to move off propane, which we have, and move. I have propane water heaters. I have propane for my stove. And there's a lot of conversion for furnaces that go with that. I have 2 furnaces in my house, and so there's a lot of cost not only for that conversion but to put it in. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but these are not simple solutions, right? These are very complex. You have a tremendous amount of trade-offs that are involved. And so it's easy to say, like when Palo Alto said, well, we'll just put this loan program into place. And they did that first before they looked into, well, how much is this really going to cost us? Mm-hmm. And now that it looks like it's going to cost, they've now, are now starting that, well, maybe we should start off with a smaller group than what than initially we thought. But in California, they routinely run out of money for rebates for EVs, for especially the economically disadvantaged. We're going to give you this money, go buy an EV, and the rebate's in the mail, right? And so you can't ask somebody to put this money out front and then not, give them that money back in a timely fashion. So it's a mess. We don't have. It's not only just the physical infrastructure. We don't have the process infrastructure, the administrative infrastructure to make this transition happen easily, right? Just with permits. Right? One of the charging companies they scream bloody murder because it takes so long to get a permit, right? And even after you build the charging station, in California now, Electrify America, which has to, because of the diesel, Volkswagen diesel scandal, right? Had to put all these billions to build chargers, EV chargers. It may take them half a year after they've had their charging station built for it to get approved to be turned on. Yeah. Okay. So, these are just all this friction that comes into play.
And one of the things I talked about with Bob in the last interview on this stuff is just like decision-making and policy-making capacity around this stuff, I think you hear in the conversation that when we make policy around EVs, we're not thinking through all these systemic dimensions of it. But where does the capacity to do that lie right now? I mean, it's just like, it's a big question.
Well, again, you go to local utility commissions, a lot of them are not people with any background in public utility, right? So you have, and a lot of them are elected. So, you have an elected commissioner, they're not going to get elected by saying, hey, we're going to get rid of your car. You're going to have to spend, $60,000 on an EV. Oh, also an extra $5,000 for your charger at home. And, oh yeah, we're going to tax you. Elect me. That's not, a really winning slogan for most counties.
Well, that kind of leads into a follow-up question I wanted to ask, though, and I don't want to open up too big of a can of worms, but I guess I was asking, or I was wondering, like, how viable or feasible you would see expanding carbon taxes on large corporations when it comes to paying for this. See it as a sliding scale versus CO2 emissions.
Well, carbon taxes is a pretty deep technical discussion, right? And figuring out, there's a big group that wants carbon taxes as being the easiest way to actually pay for all this and to actually be able to get an understanding of what those costs should be. The biggest emitter should pay the most amount. That's the basis, of that. The trouble is how do you actually measure that in a way that you can actually be fair about it, right? And then you also have the problem on the other side of, well, they can't afford it to do that because there's a tremendous amount of money that you have to, in some of these older industries to make that transition. So you allow them to buy credit, right? They're still polluting like crazy, right? It's just somebody else who's polluting less, right? Yeah. Tesla makes a tremendous amount of money off selling its credits, right? In California and other states. So the carbon tax seems to be the simplest way forward, but like all things, it's not simple. So, we could talk about that offline if you'd like, but that is kind of an interesting, it's not a can of worms, right? It's a, 1,000, it's a 1,000-gallon, bucket of worms.
Yeah. Anyone else in the room have questions?
Thanks for the info.
Anybody else? Yeah, Cameron, you want to ask something? We got about 10 minutes left.
I was thinking about, you know, a lot of the policies are happening at the state level for some of this stuff. And you've got some states that are, you mentioned like right to charge in the article. And it seems like states that are passing legislation like that have an interest in seeing more EV charging. And so I wonder if there have been like financial mechanisms or like government, like I would be interested in seeing, because I think you identify one of the core problems is the high upfront cost of installing chargers. And I wonder if some like basic financing of like, maybe the state of California says, we'll pay for your upfront cost of installation, and you just got to pay us back over 5 years, you know? And I don't know if that would help, or that would like lower some, maybe not for renters where the problem is still that they're not going to keep it, but definitely I think for some homeowners who don't have that kind of upfront capital, but would benefit maybe from a...
Yeah, they've talked, certain states do have credits, right? And again, it's a tax credit thing. Now, the problem with the tax credit is that if you don't pay taxes, you don't get any credit, right? So the lower economic strata don't benefit. That's one of the problems with the EV rebates right now. Now that's going to change.
But what if it was a loan program? I think he's asking.
Yeah, but even with a loan program, the problem is how do you what's the credit? You know, who owns at the end of the day? Who's on the hook if that loan isn't paid back, right? And this is, again, at Palo Alto, this is one of the questions that they were looking at, is saying, well, okay, we have a no interest loan to electrify your home, which would include a charger, right? As well, your solar panels and convert your furnaces. But if they walk away, right, what's the penalty? And right now, there isn't any penalty. And so that they're looking and they're saying, well, have we just invited people to take out these loans and then never pay us back?
Yeah.
So now does the government become a credit agency, right? Or do you outsource that to a third-party credit? Or do you just have a big, forgiveness? Which in that case, you might as well just give everybody, the money.
Free chargers,
right? So, it might be better in one sense for the state to buy at a discount at volume 1 million chargers and stick them in warehouses, or pay somebody to stick them in warehouses, and then you get them basically for free, right? And so you just pay the installation cost, and then you could have a credit. You could do there's lots of different ways of looking at this. There just hasn't been a lot of innovation on it. Now, the things like states like Massachusetts, which want to go to 1 million EVs, 1 million solar panels on homes, and I forget how many chargers. I want to say 1 million, but I don't think it's that many. All want to do that by 2030. Well, their starting point is it's 1 million heat pumps. That's what they want to have.
Oh, yeah.
But the starting point is 50,000 EVs. Right. Their starting point is about 100,000, I think, solar panels, and about 50,000 or so heat pumps that they've been able to install. So if you take a look at the numbers, that ramp is straight up. And again, if you're asking people to put in $50,000, $60,000, that's a lot. And even though, again, you might be able to get a $10,000 grant, you're still stuck with that other bit, because again, the states cannot. When you really add up all the numbers, the states don't have that much money to actually, be able to throw at all this. So they can do bits and pieces, but there's not any way that they can do it even at the national level. It's pretty hard. Like the NEVI program, which is to do the corridor charging, right? One EV charger every 50 miles, right, at a station. That's paid for. 80% of that cost for the first 5 years is paid for by the federal government. But even with that, people are not really sure that for a lot of locations that they won't go belly up on, year 5 plus day 1. So again, there's a lot to this to unpack, and so there's no easy solutions. That's the bottom line. But I think there could be innovative solutions where you could incentivize it. One of the problems that again with chargers in inner cities is that the utilization rates are down to 0, but you still put in all that money to put these chargers in. So, do you just use, that's a societal cost that's picked up, but how long can you continue to do that? Because sooner or later, wear and tear, even on a charger that's not being used, these are mechanical devices, they have to be
entropy
happens. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't want to sound negative in all this. It's just that
no, man, for me, I think it's just like drilling down. It's just good to have the complexity of it in front of us. And I think that, just for teaching and thinking about technology policy and climate change and all these issues we face, EVs are such an iconic and almost fetishistic example in our culture. You can think of Musk, and Teslas are so cool, but obviously when you start burrowing into it, there's a lot of complexities there that we're just not talking about in society. So for me, it's much larger than EVs. Actually, it's about thinking and decision making.
Yeah, EVs are a symptom, not the cause.
Yeah.
And again, I think that my plea has always been in writing these stories has been just to think through. There's an old saying in risk management that to master the risk, you got to master the detail. And we haven't been mastering the detail, and that's where we keep falling. When you actually go in and you start doing the engineering and you say, okay, I want to have a charging station out in Wyoming, but the closest gasoline station is 200 miles away because there's nobody out there. Well, how am I going to run an electric line out there? Okay, well, you're not going to run an electric line. I'm going to run a solar. I'll put solar instead. Okay, well, what's my cost now? Right, and so all these things, there's no simple solutions to these things.
Yeah,
and so you have to look at it. It's the old, you got to bite the elephant, or eat the elephant one bite at a time.
Yeah,
and we're just trying to swallow it whole. And so it's I forget who talked about dividing it up and segmenting it, but that's pretty much what we have to do. And I also think that the states, if you're an OEM and you're looking at every state is starting to have their own EV policy.
Yeah. That's a disaster.
That makes it extremely difficult for you to decide what you're going to do.
Yeah, totally. Well, Bob, thank you for coming back on, man. I think you're a first repeat guest, so it's been fun having you on.
Well, I like being here, and I like the questions your students ask me. A lot of really good questions. That's really great. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the university libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.
you